All right. So now we are on air and it's recording already. But the beginning of the webinars are usually edited out by Ludovico's team so that it starts with when I introduce you and you start speaking.
People are joining. You can see people joining.
Yeah. Okay. We'll give it another minute and then we start. So shall we start, Ludovico?
Go ahead.
All right. So good morning again. Here we are in the Inequality and Poverty in Latin America course. And today we are delighted to have Marco Stampini from the Inter-American Development Bank speaking on cash transfers in Latin America. This is part of the set of papers that have been already published in Oxford Open Economics earlier this month. And it's actually a very nice comprehensive paper that covers pretty much everything that we need to know about cash transfers in the region. And I'm sure our students and the audience will be delighted to listen what you have to say today, Marco. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to share a little bit about your career, how did you get to be at the IDB and working on this topic? We usually ask speakers to share with the students and the audience a little bit about themselves. And thanks again for doing this.
Okay. Thank you, Nora. So something about my background. I'm an economist, I'm Italian. I studied a PhD in public economics, and then immediately after finishing my PhD, I was hired by a person working in the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization to work on an evaluation of a cash transfer program called Progressa, and that was in 2001. So my studies had not been in development economics, but then I started working on program evaluations of cash transfers, and then on several topics of development economics. And then in this area, I've remained for the following 24 years. First as a consultant for organizations, then I went to work for the African Development Bank in a research department that is the regional development bank that covers Africa. And then I got a job at the Inter-American Development Bank, working mostly on cash transfers for the first few years. And then now I'm equally split between cash transfer programs and care, which is a new important part of social protection, because many countries are understanding that we cannot reduce poverty if we don't also address time poverty, and therefore my work now is divided between these two areas. Okay, so this is in a nutshell how I came to work on these subjects. It's a very big area of work for development banks, for the Inter-American Development Bank. So ready to start with the presentation whenever you want, or should I just transition?
Yeah, if I may add something that before the historical record is that the Inter-American Development Bank was actually were the first meeting to discuss the impact evaluation of Progresa pretty much a few months after it was launched, took place. So the IDB has been part of the evolution of the cash transfers from the very, very, very beginning, since, as we know, Progresa was one of the first ones. I mean, there's a dispute whether Brazil, I think Brazil is the one that started with Bolsa Escola. And we actually also held meetings at that time. I was at the IDB, as you know. I held meetings very early on in which both programs were featured and discussed, and invited the people who conceived them and launched them in both cases. So just, to complement with a historical fact.
Excellent. So I'm going to share my screen now, and actually I will show at some point a slide that is in line with what you, Nora, just said about the work of the IDB with conditional cash transfers. Okay. So the paper that I present today is called Cash Transfers, Poverty and Inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean, because it's a review of cash transfers that was done for the Latin America Inequality Review. Last year, Latin America and the Caribbean Inequality Review. And the focus was to try to understand if these programs have an effect on poverty and inequality, and if that effect is as large as people wanted, or if there are some characteristics that reduce the impact that they are having on poverty and inequality. So we will be looking at 3 types of cash transfers, and I will spend a little bit of time at the beginning in explaining what they are and how they are different. Conditional cash transfers, non-contributory pensions, and other unconditional cash transfers. And for a lot of time, the focus of our studies was on conditional cash transfers that are the largest category, but in this study, we looked at all these types of programs, and as I will mention later, other unconditional cash transfers have been very important in the response of the region to the COVID crisis. So first, what are conditional cash transfers? They are programs originated as an innovation in Latin America and the Caribbean in the mid of the 1990s. As Nora was mentioning, first, they started in Brazil as programs of some municipalities or states. And then they started at a national level in Mexico, maybe the first program that really had conditions on health and education, while Bolsa Escola in Brazil had only conditions on education. The idea was that, first of all, they broke the paradigm, the pre-existing paradigm that people living in poverty or in vulnerability don't know what to do for their own well-being. And therefore, it's not necessary to deliver some bag of food or some concrete investment in their community, but that a lot can be done by transferring cash. And this is very important because transferring cash has very limited, very low administrative costs, while every other type of program that pre-existed had much higher administration costs. But at the same time, they wanted to create a contract between governments and families, in that families were asked to comply with a series of conditions, and they would only get the cash transfer if, for example, their children were vaccinated, if their children attended health checkups, if they participated, attended in at least 85% of school days in primary school and then also in secondary school. The conditions have evolved over time, but the original conditions were mostly vaccination, health checkup for children, and primary and sometimes secondary school attendance. Another innovation was that payments were made to women, because it was considered that women would spend them very consciously for the well-being of the family and their children, and also to address the intra-family bargaining power of men and women. Targeting was always a combination of demographic criteria, for example, families with children, and means testing, which means that programs wanted the families to have an income under a certain threshold, either income or an estimation of income, and we'll talk a bit later about this. They created conditional cash transfers, an absolute revolution in public policy evaluation, because if you search in Google conditional cash transfers impact evaluation, you will find over 10,000 probably publications on these programs, which meant that they were extensively evaluated and therefore very credible in their results. So documented impacts, they are a very broad range of impacts that have been rigorously demonstrated through impact evaluations. So on poverty, lower poverty, higher consumption, improved nutrition, and for sure, increased consumption of education and healthcare services. Now, I put a question mark on learning because although all the programs achieved the higher consumption of schooling, the effects on learning have been, the evidence on the effect of learning has been more mixed. And a big moderator of the effect of these programs on learning is the quality of the schools that is attended by program beneficiaries. And if you read publication on conditional cash transfers, we try sometimes to make the point that in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, there remains a huge difference in learning achievement between people in the top quintile of the income distribution and people in the lowest quintile of the income distribution. It means that in the region, poor people keep learning much less than rich people. And this difference is much bigger in Latin America and the Caribbean than it is, for example, in European countries. And that has a lot to do with the impact of these programs on learning. But other impacts shown on early childhood development, on savings and productive investments, women empowerment, etc. Now, if you want to know a lot of what we learn in the IDP in 20 years of support to the implementation of conditional cash transfers in Latin America and the Caribbean, this is a book that we published in 2017. I think it's still very useful as a reference. It has a part on selecting beneficiaries, a part on the conditions that are imposed to families, a part on the ways in which the payments are transferred to the families, and it has some evidence from the literature, but it is also a very applied publication. Non-contributory pensions. So when conditional cash transfers were created in the mid of the 1990s, and then they have expanded a lot in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also all over the world, social pensions, that is the pensions that are paid to people that are not in the contributory system, existed in the region, but they were not as large as they are today. In parallel to the expansion of conditional cash transfers in Latin America and the Caribbean, you can also observe a big expansion of non-contributory pensions. So these are pensions that aim to solve the problem that in Latin America and the Caribbean, the coverage of contributory pensions is very low, which is due mostly to informality of the labor markets. And this expansion has determined a situation in which, for example, between 2000 and 2019, the share of people aged 50 to 80 that have absolutely no source of income has decreased from 29% to 18%. So that gives you an idea of the expansion of these programs. They are usually paid to people that are over age threshold, for example, 65 years old, sometimes 60, not receiving another pension in most cases, but not always. For example, in Guyana, you have a universal pension that is paid to every citizen older than 65. And even people that work in the government that are older than 65 keep receiving this program. And that is not a mistake. This is by design. And that there is always a trade-off between...
That's the case in Mexico as well. People receive it regardless of whether they have other pensions.
Yeah. And that's a more recent development. So very good point. And then they have an impact that has been demonstrated on poverty and also on some indicator of general well-being, like geriatric depression indicators. The literature on these programs is a bit smaller, but still you find very interesting studies. Other unconditional cash transfers. I say other unconditional because non-contributory pensions are unconditional cash transfers. They are not paid if you generally not paid conditional on complying on some conditions or some behaviors. Although there are exceptions, for example, the non-contributory pension in Panama requires that older people attend a yearly health checkup. But they are a broad category of programs. So you have sometimes child allowances. For example, universal child allowance in Suriname, not conditional on health checkups. It's an unconditional program. It's universal. Then you have programs for people with disabilities that are targeted based on disability, sometimes also with an income threshold, means testing. And then sometimes you have subsidies that are paid instead of energy subsidies. So for example, in the Dominican Republic, when the conditional cash transfer program was rolled out, you had a substitution of what were before untargeted energy subsidies. They were replaced with cash subsidies paid to everybody in poverty and vulnerability, and that became the biggest program in the country. So you see that are very different types of programs with very different objectives. They are the largest type of programs in Chile, Dominican Republic, and Suriname, and many of the impacts that you saw before when I talked about conditional cash transfers have been documented also for unconditional cash transfers. There is a very long debate between supporters of unconditional and conditional cash transfers, for example, on whether you need the conditions in order to achieve more consumption of schooling and healthcare. And this is because when you increase families' income, you always have also that richer families demand more education and more healthcare. So you see also some increase in the consumption of these goods, even without the conditions. And these programs have been extremely useful and really the backbone of the response to COVID-19 crisis. Also because even conditional cash transfers during the COVID crisis were run basically as unconditional because schools were closed. So if you want to know a lot about unconditional cash transfer programs and all the impacts that have been documented in the literature, I recommend that you look at these Oxford Policy Management and Overseas Development Institute publication that is from probably 2016, but again, very, very useful publication that is a review of impact evaluations from 165 studies in many, many countries in all continents. Now, how big are these three categories of programs in Latin America and the Caribbean? And the question that will follow is, are they big enough? So these are the numbers. You have 166 million people receiving some type of program, and this is 30% of the population of Latin America and the Caribbean. Here we counted the beneficiaries in 17 countries. I don't exclude that there are some programs run also in countries for which we didn't have the data, but we surely are including all the biggest countries, and we are also extrapolating the number of beneficiaries. Now, the biggest category is conditional cash transfers, and if you look at the numbers in countries, you have here Bolsa Familia in Brazil that has more than 10 million families, 47 million people. And you had also the Mexican conditional cash transfer program before it was replaced by a number of other programs around the time of this analysis. These are data from 2019, because we are now doing this analysis also for later years. But in 2020, with the COVID crisis, there was a revolution in these programs. And I argue that the region has not reached the steady state, the new steady state post-COVID, because also we don't have data from 2024 or 2025. We can only look at data from 2022, 2023, and many countries were still implementing COVID response programs in 2023. And then you see about 30 million people. This is not 30 million older people receiving non-contributory pensions. This is 30 million people living in households where somebody is receiving a pension, and 33 million people living in a households where somebody is receiving an unconditional cash transfers. Now, for conditional and unconditional cash transfers, it's almost obvious to look at members of families receiving programs. For non-contributory pensions, you could also look at older people themselves, because the program is individually targeted, and you could have two older people living in a family, both receiving the transfer. So, but in order to compare different programs, we wanted to look at family members for all types of programs. Also, older people tend to live in much smaller families. So you might have a ratio of 1 to 4 when you compare families and members for conditional cash transfers, and a ratio of 1 to 2 when you compare individual beneficiaries and members of families for pensions. So this is the first fact. This is numbers, very big, 30% of the population, with CCTs being the largest category. Now, second question is, do these programs change poverty and inequality a lot? And I'm going to show you another very big table, but the numbers that I want you to focus on are the ones that are in red. So on average in the region, when you count the number of people living in poverty, all these programs reduce poverty at count by 2 percentage points, from 31% poverty rate before transfers to 29% poverty rate after transfers. Now, not all transfers lift people out of poverty. You need to understand, if you target the transfer to people that are very poor and you don't give them a large transfer, you might have an impact on poverty, even if people are not lifted out of poverty. So this head count, it's a partial look at how much these programs reduce poverty in the region. That's why the other indicator, the poverty gap, is trying to look at how much you reduce the gap that people experience in their income, the distance from the poverty line. And you see the impact is still 2 percentage points, but on a much smaller indicator. The indicator is half the size. So in terms of poverty gap, you have double the relative effect of these programs on poverty. And then on inequality, you have a smaller effect, which is 0.7 percentage point, or 0.7 points of the Gini coefficient of the distribution of income. Now, if you look at countries, you see that some countries have a much larger impact. You look at Argentina, you have a drop of 5 percentage points in poverty due to cash transfers, starting from a head count of 12.9%. So you have almost that these programs cut by half the number of people living in poverty. And if you look at other countries like Suriname, Panama, or Dominican Republic, sorry, I'm getting all the lines wrong, apologies. So if you look at Chile, Costa Rica, Panama, Suriname, Uruguay, you always have impacts that are more than 3 percentage points on the poverty head counts. So for example, Panama implements almost universal scholarship that every child in the country receives unless they go to a private school that costs more than about $1,000 per year. And that program has a lot of impact on poverty because it's a quite generous transfer. Now question, could the effect of these programs be larger? Or why are, what explains the number that we just looked in the last slide? We are going to look at 3 things. Is the size appropriate? Are these programs well targeted? And do conditionalities limit the reach and retention? The last point is we will discuss much more shortly, but the first 2 points are the bulk of today's presentation. So question, is the program size appropriate? Now, if we had an interactive class now, I would ask you, what is an appropriate size? Do you want a program that reaches the people living in poverty? Do you want a program that reaches everybody? And this is a very important trade-off, because if I have a program that targets only people in poverty, I have 2 considerations to make. One, I'm saving money. And second, I have an efficient program, but then I need to be able to select people living in poverty perfectly. On the other hand, when I have a universal program, then I have a lot of social support for the program because it's not seen as a program for the poor. It's seen as a program that everybody's going to get. So you need to choose between efficiency and social support in a way. Now, the big problem that we have is that although the number of people living in poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean is almost the same as the number of beneficiaries of these programs, actually, yes. So beneficiaries, we saw 166 million people. People living in poverty with an international definition of poverty, 175 million people. So you will, and actually, apologies, I was already jumping too much ahead in the presentation. So the first thing is the number of beneficiaries of these programs is almost the same as the number of people living in poverty. Now, on average in the region, you have this indicator which is rounded to 1. It's probably 0.95 or 96. This hides a lot of heterogeneity across countries. You have countries where the number of beneficiaries is less than 10% of the number of people living in poverty, and you have other countries that have a much more universal approach, like Bolivia or Chile or Argentina or Panama, where you have more than twice the number of beneficiaries than the number of people living in poverty. So going back to what I was saying before, there are 2 rationales for having this large number of beneficiaries: having a broad support for these programs, having the population know that even if they are not poor now, but they are vulnerable, they fall in poverty, they are going to get some support. And the other thing is that countries know that there is no way to target the people living in poverty perfectly. And we'll look at this in detail later. Okay, now, are the programs big enough? Also means, is the transfer that families get large enough to address poverty? And here we have another big trade-off. Let me start with the number here. On average in the region, the value of the cash transfer is 1/3 of the poverty gap. So imagine that the poverty line in the country where you live is $100, and you live in a family of one person, so it's only you. You need $100 not to be poor. And your income is zero. This means that the cash transfer is giving you $33. So this is, you need $100 to fill the poverty gap. You are getting 1/3 of that. Now, there is no country in the region that gives transfers that are large enough to close the poverty gap. The most generous country by far in our analysis is Argentina. You get 90% of the poverty gap. And in other countries like Uruguay, Guyana, or Costa Rica, you get about half of the poverty gap.
Sorry, Marco, this is data that probably for Argentina is dated, right? Or
2019. Everything that I'm presenting here is from 2019. And it could have changed a
Since
lot.
then, they have slashed a lot of the programs, I think, in Argentina. So probably.
Yeah, so apologies. Keep this caveat in mind. Everything that we are saying in this presentation is pre-COVID and dated 2019. And then here, there is a lot of discussion between two different objectives of cash transfers. One is to reduce poverty right now. The other is to reduce poverty in the next generation. So for example, many implementers of conditional cash transfers, or even some of the literature, argue that if $5 are enough to convince a family that is not schooling their children to send their children to school, then go with $5. And you are not reducing poverty very much, but you are ensuring school attendance, and the next generation, if they learn, they will be less poor. And then another part of supporters of cash transfers that say, but what about poverty today? You can't give only $5. You should give, in this case, $90 to try to lift family out of poverty today. So you have this big, big trade-off. And the result here is that on average in the region, you are covering only 1/3 of the poverty gap, with a lot, of course, of heterogeneity across countries. And this other slide shows something similar. It shows in the third column the ratio between aggregate poverty gap in the country and budget spent in cash transfers. And then in the fifth column, it shows the budget as a percentage of GDP. So you see, for example, total in the region, the countries are spending 0.79% of GDP in cash transfers, and this represents about 38% of the aggregate poverty gap in the region, with some countries in 2019 spending much more, like, for example, more than 100% of the aggregate poverty gap in the top two countries in the table, and spending, some cases like Bolivia, 2% of GDP in these programs. Bolivia is characterized by programs that reach almost everybody in the country with relatively small value. And you very often have a trade-off about between how many people you cover with the transfers and how big is the transfer for every beneficiary. Now, are the transfers well targeted? we have almost the same number of beneficiaries as the number of people living in poverty. Are the beneficiaries that people living in poverty? Let's look at this. This is the percentage of people living in poverty that is receiving a cash transfers. Average in the region, 55%. So if you put the pieces of information together, these that we are showing now and what we saw before, you could almost think that about half of the beneficiaries are not living in poverty, because we had a number of beneficiaries that is almost the same as the people living in poverty, but among the people living in poverty, only half is receiving a cash transfer. So this is due to a lot of reasons, and we're going to look at that in the next slides. But this is the table that shows the percentage of coverage that you have in every country that we were able to study. So let's look at why poor people, why people living in poverty are not in the programs. So first of all, you have what we sometimes call the last mile of social protection, which is people living in poverty may not even apply for the program. They may live in very remote areas. They don't know or they don't trust the government programs. Either they don't apply or the government programs don't reach them and look for them, and they remain out because they never applied. Second reason, they may apply and they are mistakenly classified as non-eligible. So here you have a difference between income and means testing and proxy means testing. So one thing is to say, you are poor if your income is under the poverty line, therefore you need to receive the program. But I don't know your income. So either I do like in Brazil, where you declare your income and you sign that this is really your income. And then if we find out that your income is not what you declared, then that's a crime that you did. Or you do like many countries in the region do, and you use a proxy means testing, which is an estimated income, which means that I look at all the family and dwelling characteristics. I look at the floor in your house. I look at the material of your walls. I look at your roof, if you have a cell phone, and I look at a number of other characteristics, and then I estimate statistically what is my prediction of your income, and then I compare it to an eligibility threshold. And every statistical model, you can do it with the old linear regression, you can do it with modern machine learning, you always have errors. And I want to show you the pictures of an error. So this was a family that had nearly zero income in a country of the region, and it was classified by the proxy means test as non-poor. You see they have walls that are made of bricks. They have a roof, but they have no income. So based on this estimation, they were classified as non-poor, but we know they were poor. And this is the case for many families. So you need to decide in a way, is it more of a problem for you to have families like that don't enter the program? Or is it more of a problem for you to have families that don't need the program that enter the program? So this is an exclusion error, the others are inclusion errors. What is worse for you as a policymaker? And then finally, you might have that people are determined eligible, but there is no space in the rosters. The budget is limited and there is a waiting list. And during the COVID crisis, this was a big problem in many countries. So let me show you one of the few studies that tried to look at that in Mexico. And they surveyed families, they identified 100 families, and they tried to see why they were not in the programs. So they had 100 families that were all poor, so they should have all been in the program. Now, only 78 of them knew that the programs existed and had applied. So 22 were lost because of the last mile of the social protection. Then you had 66 that applied to it. So 12 knew that the program existed, but they didn't apply. Maybe they didn't want to be in the program. They didn't trust the government would accept them, etc. And then of those that applied, of the 66 that applied, 47 were accepted, which means that about 2/3 of the applicants that were really poor were accepted in the program. And so 19 were lost to errors of targeting. This is very, very good study. You have very few studies like that that try to break down why people are not in the programs. Now, this is another analysis that we did in the paper, which is you can have a perfect means testing, but you might have programs that are targeting some demographic characteristics that is different from the characteristics of poverty in the country. So let's take Guyana, for example, where households with children represent 63% of the people living in poverty, but they are only 12% of the share of the beneficiaries. This is also due to some data problems, because in the survey for Guyana, we can only identify the pension, which is, however, the largest anti-poverty program in the country, or at least it was at the time of this study in 2019. Now, because the program that we are capturing in the analysis is the pension, you have that the families living in a household with an older person are the bulk of the beneficiaries, of course, but also people, older people are relatively less poor than children. So if you have most poverty among children and your program is a pension, then by definition, the design of your targeting by population seems to be skewed, and you're not getting to all the populations that you want to reach. Now, in contrast, Bolivia has an almost equal share of children or families with children among the poor and among the beneficiaries, and also of the elderly among the poor and among the beneficiaries. It means that Bolivia is reaching at least every group living in poverty with the right proportion of cash transfers beneficiaries. So in some cases, you might have that some families are excluded because the program is targeting a certain demographic group and excluding some others living in poverty. Okay, here I should have put a title before this jump into this, because here we move to the other big idea of quality of targeting, which is leakage. Meaning, given that you saw that only half of the people in poverty were getting the program, it means that some beneficiaries are above the poverty line. So what is the percentage of beneficiaries that are above the poverty line? In the region, it's 41%. Now, I want to put a caveat, and that's why there is the other column here. 29%, or 3 out of 4 of these people, are not poor, but they are vulnerable. So they are above the poverty line, but they are below the vulnerability line. So which means that in the region, on average, only 12% of the beneficiaries of cash transfers are in what we call the middle income or high income group. Now, said that, you see a lot of variation across countries. You see, for example, in Bolivia, 74% of the beneficiaries are above the poverty line, and this is by design. This is not a mistake. Bolivia has basically universal programs. If you have a child or an older people in the family, you get cash transfers. So by design, the country wants this type of programs. And if you're reaching everybody, that's maybe not a problem to have people above the poverty line. Now, the problem is that when you have small programs, like in some of the countries that you see on the top of the table, then every person that you pay above the poverty line is a person that you lose under the poverty line, given the roster of beneficiaries. And therefore, this leakage or this inclusion error, if you want, can be a problem because you are sending part of the budget to population above the poverty line, where there are many people under the poverty line that are not getting anything. Why? Let me see. Okay, so why do you have this leakage? So the first reason is what we just discussed for Bolivia. Or for Panama, I said before, the Beca Universal, PASEU. These are programs that are large by design. You want to have a broad pool of beneficiaries that are also vulnerable. You know that people that are vulnerable will fall in poverty next year or in 2 years, and you want to have a program that is already serving them. You want to have a broad support for these programs, so you design this type of programs that try to reach all the population by design. Second, you have targeting errors. As well as I showed you before the picture of a family that should have been in the program and was not, you will have another family that should not be in the program and is in the program by an error of the statistical model that I use for targeting. Errors are unavoidable no matter what sophisticated modern estimation technique you try to use. And therefore, you have this type of problem. You also have that poverty is dynamic. People are poor this year, they are not poor next year. And so you do the targeting, even if you get it perfectly in 2025, you'll have in 2026 that part of the people in poverty will have exited poverty and people that were not in poverty entered poverty. And you don't have in any country of the region so far a type of targeting that is so dynamic that you can replace every year beneficiaries based on their entry or exit from poverty. And here, I try to put a couple of relationships in a figure to show you that if you want to have a lot of coverage of people living in poverty, which is in the vertical axis, if you want to have 100% of people in poverty receiving a cash transfer, you need very large programs. You need programs where a lot of the population is getting these programs. So, for example, you see countries like Uruguay or Bolivia, where the number of beneficiaries is more than double of the population in poverty. They also have the highest coverage of the population in poverty. So given that you have all these errors and all this dynamic in poverty, if you want to make sure that the population in poverty receives income support, you need to have many people in the rosters of beneficiaries. And second, if you want to have this large coverage, you also need to accept more leakage. By definition, if you have large programs that cover a lot of the population in poverty, you are also going to get more people that are getting the program despite being above the poverty line. You cannot get perfect targeting anywhere. Countries in this figure should be worried if their amount of leakage is above the line, because that means that their targeting is less precise than you could expect given the level of coverage of the population in poverty that you have in the country. Now, one of the last points that I want to make in this presentation is about conditionalities. Are conditionalities a problem in terms of keeping people in the program? The literature is quite limited on this. But I wanted to put the results of a qualitative study that was done in Mexico in the mid of the year 2000 to try to understand why about 1 million young people that should have been in the conditional cash transfer programs of the country were actually not receiving them. And these are all the problems that were highlighted by families of these 1 million people. So first of all, you might have economic reasons. You have costs to go to school or costs to attend health checkups. And sometimes the value of the transfers is less than what you need to spend to reach the school or the health center. That might be the situation for people that live in very extreme areas where reaching education or healthcare takes a lot of time and takes money. Then you have, I would say, the second and third bullet that group together the lack of special education. So when we look at early childhood development, which is the education of children younger than 4, we see that families living in poverty reach age 4 or 5 with a vocabulary that is equivalent generally to 1 year less of age relative to people that live in families with high income, which means that you enter school with a developmental delay of 1 year. Now, if you enter school with a developmental delay of 1 year, it means that you will often be the student that struggles most to learn, and you might be singled out, you might be stigmatized in school, you might require special education that is never available in schools attended by people living in poverty. So some beneficiaries of the study that are also reported in the paper that I am summarizing today report that they felt targeted by teachers, they were not given the proper kind of teaching, and they dropped out. And then the fourth and the fifth bullet focuses on secondary school more than on primary school. And these are people that live in communities where they find that the teaching doesn't give them anything in practice. They feel that the learning is irrelevant, the learning is not useful to find a job, and they often end up doing the same job that other people that didn't go to school do, and therefore they leave the programs. And I give you a couple of quotations from studies. I'm going to translate it here. So one is a beneficiary of the cash transfers in Mexico, says, youth with that completed primary or secondary school do exactly the same thing that I do with no difference. Women are at home and the guys are in the field. Those that study come back to the same community and end up doing the same. So if the youth perceive that there is no learning, perceive that there is no return to education, sometimes they end up giving up schooling. And because the program is conditional, they end up also dropping out, them and the family, from the program. So that means that sometimes if you wanted to reduce poverty today, maybe these conditions would be decreasing your impact on poverty because they would end up excluding families that dropped out from school for different reasons that we discussed in the previous slide. And another study said that a little bit more than 30% of beneficiaries of Oportunidades program in Mexico once they completed primary school. They were not able to have basic language skills that allow them to read and satisfactorily continue their studies in secondary school. And that this percentage of people with problems in learning and in the results of learning was as high as 57% in children that had attended indigenous community schools. So these are examples of all the cases in which putting a condition is trying to increase learning and increase the impact on poverty in the next generation. But if you don't have the right type of school, then people might drop out and be excluded. Now, very quickly, I realize I lost track of time, and I apologize for that. A little bit of recommendations, and I actually want to skip this and go to the next one. There is a lot that we can do today on targeting that we couldn't do 25 years ago. And this is an example of a study that we did together with the government in Costa Rica to identify pockets of urban poverty. So these are people where we were able to identify that there was poverty, but people were not in the beneficiaries registries. And once you can use this type of modern technique to identify where the poverty is that has not been captured already by your programs, you need to do active search. You need to have these programs go to the field and look for people that might benefit from cash transfers, because their entry in the programs is not always automatic. I'm going to close here to give some space to the questions. Just here, one recommendation also that we gave was try to have the most as flexible as possible rosters of beneficiaries, so that you can guarantee that if people fall in poverty, they can enter more quickly. They don't have a waiting list to enter the programs. And they know that if they exit poverty, there is not a disadvantage in leaving the roster of beneficiaries, because they know that if they fall back in poverty the following year, they can re-enter. And this is the whole area of work of dynamic targeting that we are trying to do with countries, and that modern techniques are helping us to push forward. Thank you very much. And I'm stopping here for questions.
Thank you, Marco. We have a question from Jeb Wells, and I'll read it for you. If cash transfers increase consumption of education but fail to steadily increase learning, why not set up direct transfers to schools to promote quality of education? If there is space in the budget, could this also potentially be able to provide some school transport, such as buses or a car?
And that is, again, the trade-off between decreasing poverty today and poverty tomorrow. If I give transfers to the school only, I will not be decreasing poverty today. I will also not be addressing the barriers to demanding schooling. Now, if I could have the budget, I could allocate the budget as the way I want. Maybe I would want to be sure that I complement the cash transfers with transfers to school to try to increase special education, transportation to school, and improve the quality of education, and have cash transfers go to the same community where there is an investment in the quality of education, so that I can ensure that once kids go to school, they learn more than they are learning right now.
Thank you. We have two questions by Mia Zatz. First one is, how did the programs change during COVID?
Yeah. So first of all, programs that were conditionals dropped the conditions because kids couldn't go to school, and they also couldn't go to the health centers. So they were implemented temporarily as unconditional cash transfers. At the same time, the governments created many new programs. Sometimes they increased the transfers for the beneficiaries of existing programs, more transfers. Sometimes they included more families in the programs. They had some pockets of families that were registered but not benefiting from the program, so they were added to the programs. At the same time, in countries where there were not sufficient records in the social registries or in the beneficiary registries, new programs were created. For example, in Belize, the government did an unemployment relief program for people in the informal economy. And so people were asked to register for these new programs. So new programs were created. We saw an increase in poverty and an increase in the number of beneficiaries in 2020. And then afterward, 2021, 2022, a contraction both in poverty and in the number of beneficiaries. We are finishing a study right now that should be available in a couple of months where you can see these trends. Also, in some countries, governments made new programs using very innovative tools. For example, in Panama, and I think also in Paraguay, a transfer was given using the number of the identity card. So you have the identity card, everybody has it, they have a number. People got a balance in a virtual account that corresponded to that number. They could go to a supermarket, and through their identity card, they could buy food using this virtual account. So there were lots of innovations done during the COVID. Also, another thing is that countries started to look different at the relative importance of inclusion and exclusion errors. Before the crisis, maybe some people were saying these programs are not efficient, you need to do them more efficiently. When the COVID crisis hit, countries realized that they needed a broad program and that it didn't matter very much if some people that didn't need the program was getting a cash transfer, because the main goal was to reach everybody who needed it, and therefore it was okay to get some inclusion errors. Mm-hmm. So that's, in a nutshell, the answer to this very broad question.
Yeah. And so for the programs that don't have the budget to accept all families below the poverty line, how do they decide who gets into the program and who doesn't?
So in an ideal world, you might think that you have a measure of income for everybody and you accept the people that are farthest from the poverty line. Mm-hmm. But in practice, it works with geographic targeting. So the government may decide that they only implement the program in some parts of the countries. And that's an example. For example, in Peru, the program Juntos was implemented before the pandemic, mostly or only in rural areas. And then now the government has expanded also to urban areas. So very often it's limited to some population group with demographic targeting or to some geographic areas.
Excellent. Nora, do you have any questions?
I have, well, one comment is that tying what you presented today, thank you very much, Marco, first of all, with the presentation on fiscal redistribution of a couple of weeks ago, I think it's that I made the presentation. An additional problem that you have in the region in some countries is that not only transfers are not large enough to pull people out of poverty, but that when you take into account what they pay in taxes, there are a bunch of poor people who are net payers into the fiscal system. So I don't know if you have incorporated that in the IDB's assessment of whether the programs are actually fighting poverty, because I assume that you're measuring poverty using disposable income. I mean, the headcount ratio or this is probably after cash transfers and direct tax pay payments, which the poor usually don't pay in Latin America. But when you add taxes that apply to consumption, then your poverty may be higher, not by a small amount. So I hope that the IDB takes this into account when it looks at at what the programs do to help, if not eradicate, reduce poverty substantially in the region. The disposable income is not a good income concept to measure poverty given the amount of indirect taxes that exist in the region. I don't know if you want to comment on that. And
Oh, yes, I admit it's a shortcoming of the study and unfortunately also of the forthcoming study because we have not done it. And it would be wonderful to include these in the same analysis because I agree. The transfers are another side of taxation, and what matters is the net redistribution. So I am afraid I must say that I'm not solving this very important problem in the next publication, but in the future it would be very important to do it.
Yeah, and I'm not only talking about the publications, but also in the advice that the IDB gives to countries.
Yeah.
When they look at, I don't know, this could be incorporated as a standard measure. I think that the World Bank has increasingly done that because it has adopted consumable income, which is the concept that takes into account subsidies and indirect taxes. So maybe, it's something that not only in the studies, but also in the policy recommendations, the IDB could help countries identify when what they pay in transfers is or is not enough to cover at least what the people pay in taxes. Because it's a little perverse, to have
Yeah.
people being net payers into the system. So that's one thing. The other thing is that in terms of, I don't know if you have a taxonomy of countries in terms of other variables, or if you have any, maybe in this upcoming publication, maybe in the one that you already produced, like political economy dynamics. I saw that in some cases, Guatemala doesn't even appear in the list of countries that you included in the tables. Not sure whether for that particular variable you didn't have it, but Guatemala is one of the countries with the highest poverty rates, and it seems to do really very, very, very little. So do we know what drives the generosity in the fiscal redistribution using cash transfers? Are there any assessments that you have done in the context of the studies that you guys have undertaken? Or I don't know if the network, the research department, if they've looked into this as well.
So unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have an analysis of the political economy that could consider over time changes in government and we have observed that over the years 2000s, the first decade, that was the period of expansion of conditional cash transfers in Latin America and the Caribbean. Basically, there has been no change relative to changes of government did not affect the trend. But in terms of what makes, first of all, at some point, programs plateaued in terms of number of beneficiaries. And then you might also have sometimes a redistribution within programs in shifting from a conditional program to a less conditional program, or that is maybe only not verifying the conditions very much, and so putting more emphasis on redistribution rather than human capital accumulation, but also of what makes Argentina different from Guatemala in terms of political economy and how this evolves over time. We don't have that analysis, which is extremely interesting. I agree.
Yeah, the political economy. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also if we think about Mexico. because with the dismantling of the Prospera, which is the name that Progresa eventually landed with, you got rid of the conditional cash transfer programs, essentially, at least conditional on some form of proxy means. You have, what do you call it, categorical targeting, not like age for the non-contributory, then some scholarships for people who are under a certain age. And I think that what the results show is that this resulted in negative impacts on the poor. From the preliminary studies that we have from Susan Parker and co-authors, the beneficiaries that are poor that stop receiving the program is important. And also there's some evidence that school attendance has been affected, particularly among males of secondary school age. So we are maybe going to be able to see what happens when you roll back some of these programs. Unfortunately, the negative impact will be suffered by people living in poverty, but it will be interesting to see whether these were just the first effects, or is it something that we'll continue to observe. I'm not sure whether you're focusing at all on, because that's an interesting case study, how it was dismantled and everything.
Yeah, I saw the presentation by Susan Parker on that paper, and I have not looked in details at what I mean. The number of beneficiaries in Mexico does not seem to have decreased. The composition of the programs has changed, and it's been replaced by more programs for older people, and then the CCT was retained as a scholarship, but then maybe less emphasis on health checkups at birth. So it has been a change, and in fact, Mexico is a country that did not react to the COVID pandemic with a change in their landscape of cash transfers, but they had changed their cash transfers the year before the pandemic. And so they addressed the crisis with the new landscape of cash transfers that they had just created.
Yeah, essentially, I think, again, if you have any leeway still to sort of focus on issues, I think the Mexican case should be studied carefully, because you did have a shift from emphasizing early childhood development more to sort of covering the elderly, and so that can have long-lasting impacts on poverty, as we know, even if the elderly may be sharing part of the resources as we know from other studies. But it is an important switch that we should probably be tracking carefully, in terms of social policy design. So I don't have any more comments, Ludwig. I don't know whether you have any.
No, fascinating, very interesting. Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, apologies for time management, meaning I didn't remember if we were going to 1:15 or 1. I could have done the presentation a bit shorter, but
it was right on time, actually.
It's lots of material.
No, it was perfect. No need to apologize, Marco. It's exactly right. Everybody did exactly the same thing as you did, so no, not a problem. And again, many, many thanks, and we'll continue the conversation, I'm sure, in other venues and settings.
Yeah, thanks
by
to
the
you.
way, if you can share your PowerPoint, please send it.
Yes, I will. I will just remove the pictures of the beneficiaries because it's not public, but that's just that family. But the rest of the presentation, of course, and if I generated some interest in this area of social protection and anti-poverty programs with the students of the master, I'll be very happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.